Many people don't know a whole lot about critical race theory or the 1619 Project, but President Trump does.
A perfect example of critical race theory was recently published by the Smithsonian Institution. Teaching this horrible doctrine to our children is a form of child abuse in the truest sense of those words.
And that alone is significant. President Trump recently announced through executive order that he was banning this sort of teaching of critical race propaganda, 1619 Project nonsense in the federal government. And even more, he's going to ban it with companies and organizations that do business with the federal government. Now, the critical race theory business, it all goes back to the idea that whites are evil, blacks are wonderful. American history is all defined by slavery. It goes all the way back to 1619. Now, it's true that the first slaves came around 1619, but there were literally like 4 of them. Even at the time of the founding, there weren't that many slaves. Slavery really spread in the 19th century after the invention of the cotton gin, and the Democratic Party arose as the champion of slavery. This is the critical fact that the 1619 Project is intended to hide and to displace. Here's Nikole Hannah-Jones talking about slavery in a somewhat unintentionally comical fashion.
We don't know about 1619 the same way that we don't learn very much about slavery. It is shameful. No one wants to talk about their sins or the worst moments. And slavery gives contradiction to our entire creation story of the United States. And so we've tried to push it aside. We've tried to make it marginal. And in doing that, we've marginalized the 40 million descendants of the enslaved as well. So what we're trying to do with this project is force us to confront the truth. And then maybe we can actually start to move past slavery and become the country that was written in our ideals in the Constitution and the Declaration.
It's an effort.
So Nikole Hannah-Jones says people don't know about 1619, and that's because there's not a lot that one needs to know about. The real explosion of slavery came after the 1790s, and it really spread in the 19th century. But second, she goes, people don't know much about slavery. Really? If there's one thing that kids in our country know about, it's that. In fact, American history is taught as if it was nothing more than a founding, slavery, a civil rights movement. Everything else is forgotten. The explosion of wealth that have made America the most successful country in the world. Who invented this and that? Kids know nothing about this. It's not even taught. All they teach is slavery, slavery, slavery. Nikole Hannah-Jones herself is a little bit of a fraud. She herself knows very little about slavery. In fact, kind of funny, but when I exposed that Kamala Harris was descended from a Jamaican white slave owner, Nikole Hannah-Jones, drawing on her expertise, said, oh man, Dinesh is, self-owned because obviously this happened because of rape on the plantation. The poor woman, Nikole Hannah-Jones, was too lazy to just look up the genealogical chart, which I published myself, showing that Kamala Harris was descended from a free woman of color who married a descendant of the slave owner. So this is the kind of fallacious nonsense that is put out by these leftists. And prominent scholars of the founding and of slavery, people like Gordon Wood at Brown, James McPherson at Princeton, have declared the 1619 Project to be a fraud. But it's a fraud pushed by the New York Times, pushed by the megaphones of the left. The great news about Trump is that he's on it. He's a president who keeps alert not just to what's going on in the electoral and political domain, but also in the cultural domain. And he's doing what he can and what the government can to stop this narrative fraud from being perpetrated on the American people.